I never expected that an emergency request at work would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a fire or a flood, not in the traditional sense, anyway. It was a storm, a threat on the horizon, and a man I had spent months watching from what I thought was a safe distance. My name is Miles. Back then, I was 28, and my world was a carefully curated collection of quiet moments and predictable routines. I was an archivist at the Northwood History Museum, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. I spent my day surrounded by the silent, orderly ghosts of the past, brittle letters, sepia-toned photographs, and the faint, sweet smell of decaying paper and binding glue. My life was contained within the climate-controlled walls of the archives and the equally quiet walls of my one-bedroom apartment. It was safe. It was stable. And if I was being honest with myself, which I tried not to be too often, it was profoundly lonely. The museum itself was the town's pride, a beautiful old granite building that had once been the personal library of a lumber baron. It stood near the town square, solid and dependable, but like anything old, it had its vulnerabilities. My domain, the archives, was housed in a newer wing, but it had one significant flaw: a wall of large, single-pane windows that my boss, Mr. Harris, referred to as his perpetual anxiety. They were slated for replacement, part of a larger restoration project the museum had undertaken. And that project was how Caleb came into my orbit. His company, C.J. Renovations, specialized in historical buildings. He was the C.J. himself, Caleb Jensen. I first saw him in the spring, when his team started work on the museum's facade. He was everything I wasn't. He moved with a confident, easy grace, his voice carrying easily over the sound of saws and sanders. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn t-shirts, and his arms were a roadmap of sun-darkened skin and faded scars. He laughed a lot, a deep, genuine sound that always made me look up from my desk. I watched him from my window, a silent, unseen observer. I saw him direct his crew with a nod or a simple gesture. I saw him patiently explain a detail of the stonework to a curious museum patron. I saw him once help an elderly woman carry her groceries up the museum's steps on his way back from a coffee run. He seemed impossibly bright, a flash of vibrant life against the muted tones of my own existence. Of course, I assumed he was straight. It was a default setting for my heart, a defense mechanism honed over years of quiet crushes and unspoken longings. He existed in a world of casual masculinity that felt a universe away from my own. Our interactions were minimal, limited to a polite nod if we passed in the hallway or a quick morning if he was getting coffee at the same time as me. Each brief encounter would leave a faint tremor in my day, a small disruption to my carefully maintained equilibrium that I would spend hours analyzing. He was a beautiful, unattainable fact of my daily life, and I had resigned myself to that. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You learn to appreciate things from a distance. Then came the storm. It started as a whisper on the local news, a tropical depression forming far out in the Atlantic, unseasonably late in the year. Within a day, it had a name and a projected path that was curving unervingly toward our coastline. By Tuesday afternoon, it was a hurricane, and the entire town was in a state of low-grade panic. Mr. Harris, my boss, was in a state of high-grade, full-blown meltdown. He burst into the archives, his face pale, and his hair looking even wilder than usual. "Miles, the windows. My God, the windows." He was waving a printout of the storm's trajectory as if it were a death sentence. The restoration schedule had the new, hurricane-rated windows being installed in 4 weeks. The storm itself was due to make landfall in less than 48 hours. "We have to board them up," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Everything. The entire wall. I can't risk it. I can't risk losing the town's history because of some meteorological freak." He was pacing now, a frantic little circuit around a table of land deeds from the 1880s. I tried to calm him down, assuring him we'd figure it out. "I've already called him," Mr. Harris said, stopping abruptly. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "He's on his way." I didn't need to ask who he was. There was only one person we would call for an emergency job involving the museum structure. My stomach did a slow, complicated flip. Caleb was coming. And not for a casual nod in the hallway. He was coming here, to my space, to fix a problem that had suddenly become very, very real. The orderly walls of my world were about to be breached. An hour later, the quiet sanctuary of the archives was filled with the sounds of industry. Caleb's truck, loaded with sheets of plywood and tools, was parked right outside. He wasn't alone. He had 2 members of his crew with him. But it was Caleb who took charge, his presence seeming to fill the entire cavernous room. He strode in, rain jacket slick with the first bands of drizzle, and his eyes immediately found mine. "Miles, right?" he asked, pulling off his work gloves. His voice was just as I remembered, deep and steady, a stark contrast to Mr. Harris's panicked energy. I just nodded, my own voice momentarily abandoning me. "Mr. Harris told me the situation," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the massive wall of windows. "We can get it done. It's going to be a long night," though he gave me a small, reassuring smile, and it felt like a spotlight had been turned on me. I felt my face flush, hoping the dim lighting of the archives would hide it. I was used to being invisible, and suddenly I was anything but. The work began in earnest. Caleb's crew handled the outside, battling the increasing wind and rain, while Caleb worked from the inside, coordinating with them through the glass. My role was to stand by, to ensure none of the archival boxes were moved improperly, to be the museum's official overseer. In reality, I mostly tried to stay out of the way, feeling clumsy and useless in the face of such focused competence. As the hours wore on, the sky outside turned from a bruised purple to an inky, starless black. The rain began to lash against the building. Caleb's crew finished their work on the outside, and, after a quick word with their boss, packed up and headed home to their own families and houses to secure. I expected Caleb to leave with them, but he didn't. He came back inside, shaking the water from his hair like a dog. "They're done out there," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the now empty room. "But I want to double-check every seal from the inside, and add a few more braces. Can't be too careful." He looked at me. "You sticking around?" The question hung in the air. I could have gone home. My apartment was only a 10-minute drive away. But the thought of leaving him here alone, of retreating back to my solitary routine while he worked to protect my world, felt wrong. It felt like cowardice. "Yes," I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. "I'm the archivist. I should be here until it's secure." A real smile spread across his face this time. It reached his eyes, which were a surprising shade of hazel, flecked with green and gold. I'd never been close enough to see that before. "Good," he said simply. "I could use the company." And so we worked. Or rather, he worked, and I helped. I passed him tools, held the flashlight steady, and helped him measure boards. We fell into an easy, unspoken rhythm. The cavernous archives, usually a place of profound silence, were now filled with the scrape of wood, the whine of a drill, and the low murmur of our voices. The professional distance between us began to dissolve, eroded by shared purpose and the growing storm outside. We talked as he worked, the conversation flowing more easily than I ever could have imagined. I asked him about his business, and he told me how he'd started it with his dad, how he loved the challenge of working with old buildings, of feeling the history in the wood and stone. He spoke with a passion that was captivating. He wasn't just a builder, he was a craftsman, a preservationist in his own right. He, in turn, asked me about my work. He didn't just feign interest, he was genuinely curious. He wanted to know what the oldest thing in the collection was, what my favorite piece of history was. I found myself telling him about the letters of a Civil War soldier, about the quiet power of holding a piece of paper that someone had poured their heart onto over a century ago. He listened intently, his head cocked to the side, his gaze never leaving my face. At one point, the main power to the museum flickered, died, and then came back on with a hum. The emergency lights, a set of harsh, battery-powered units, cast long, distorted shadows across the room. Caleb, who had been perched on a ladder, flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. When he climbed down, his face was a little paler. "You okay?" I asked. He gave a short, self-conscious laugh. "Yeah, fine. Just not a fan of storms." He ran a hand through his damp hair, avoiding my eyes. "Stupid, I know. A guy who works outside all the time." "It's not stupid," I said quietly. He looked up, seeming to appreciate the validation. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice softer now, "a tornado hit our town. Our house was fine, but our neighbor's wasn't. I remember the sound. That freight train sound everyone talks about. Never forgot it, he shrugged, as if to dismiss the weight of the memory. Anyway, enough about that. Let's get this last board up. That was the moment. That was the first real crack in the facade of the confident, unflappable man I thought he was. He was sharing a piece of his history, a vulnerability. He wasn't just Caleb the contractor anymore. He was Caleb, the boy who was still scared of the sound of a storm. My perception of him shifted, tilting on its axis. The distance I had so carefully maintained between us suddenly felt smaller, the space between us charged with a new kind of energy. We were finishing the last brace. He was on the stepladder, and I was on the ground, holding the base to keep it steady. He needed a wrench he'd left on a nearby cart. "Hey, Miles, could you grab that for me?" he asked. I turned, picked it up, and turned back to hand it to him. As I passed it up, my fingers brushed against his. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But it wasn't. His skin was rough and calloused, but warm. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. For a fraction of a second, his fingers curled slightly, a faint pressure against mine. I looked up, and he was looking down at me. The emergency lighting cast a stark glow on his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. The roar of the wind outside seemed to fade into a dull hum. The entire world narrowed to the few feet of space between us, the warmth of his hand, and the question in his gaze. He finally took the wrench, his fingers sliding away from mine, but the connection lingered, a phantom touch on my skin. He cleared his throat and turned back to his work, but something had changed. We both knew it. The air was thick with unspoken words, with a possibility that hadn't existed just a few hours before. The last screw was driven in, the final brace secured. Caleb climbed down the ladder, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "That's it," he declared, his voice a little rough. "That wall is more solid than the rest of the building now. Nothing's getting through that." We both stood there for a moment, surveying our work. The plywood was a blank, ugly shield against the world, but it felt like a monument to our shared effort. The sound of the storm was now a muffled, distant rage. We were safe. Just as a wave of relief washed over me, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The hum of the climate control systems died, plunging the archives into absolute darkness and an unnerving silence. The only light came from the small flashlight I was still holding. Its beam cut a nervous, trembling circle on the floor. The emergency lights had given up for good. "Well?" Caleb's voice came from the darkness beside me. "That's not ideal." I could hear the forced calm in his tone. I aimed the flashlight at him. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fear he'd confessed to earlier was now written plainly on his face. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "The main breaker probably tripped. It happens. But with this flooding..." I trailed off. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a relentless, deafening roar on the roof. I pulled out my phone. No signal. "Of course. I don't think either of us is going anywhere for a while," I said. The reality of the situation settled in. We were trapped together in the dark, cavernous heart of the museum. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed from the main part of the building, followed by the sickening tinkle of shattering glass. It sounded like an explosion. Caleb and I both jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was violent, a violation of the building's sanctity. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Stay here," Caleb commanded, his voice tight. He was already moving toward the door, all traces of his earlier fear gone, replaced by a sharp, protective instinct. He took the flashlight from my hand before I could protest. "No," I said, grabbing his arm. His bicep was solid as rock under my hand. "It's my responsibility. I'm coming with you." I wasn't about to let him walk into the dark alone. He hesitated for a second, then gave a curt nod. We made our way out of the archives and into the main hall. The flashlight beam danced across the familiar exhibits, now rendered strange and monstrous by the shadows. The air was cold and damp. As we rounded the corner into the grand entrance hall, we saw it. A massive oak branch, torn from one of the ancient trees on the square, had punched straight through one of the towering Palladian windows. Rain and wind were pouring in, whipping a puddle on the polished marble floor into a small frenzy. Shards of glass littered the ground like jagged diamonds. For a moment, we just stared, stunned. Then adrenaline kicked in. The display cases, I yelled over the wind. We have to move them. A collection of delicate, hand-painted porcelain was sitting directly in the path of the incoming water. Without another word, we were a team again. We worked frantically, our movements synchronized and desperate. Caleb, with his easy strength, lifted the heavier pieces while I carefully shuttled smaller, more fragile artifacts out of harm's way. We were soaked within minutes, the cold rain plastering our clothes to our skin, but neither of us noticed. The only thing that mattered was the task at hand. After moving everything vulnerable, we found buckets and bins from a janitor's closet and began a futile attempt to manage the deluge. It was a chaotic, primal dance against the storm. Finally, there was nothing more we could do but retreat. We left the buckets to their work and made our way back to the relative safety of the archives, closing the heavy door behind us and shutting out the roar of the wind. We stood there in the dark, dripping and shivering, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a profound, bone-deep chill in its wake. "Your office," Caleb said, his teeth chattering slightly. "You said it doesn't have windows, right?" I nodded, fumbling in my pocket for the key. My office was a small, cluttered room in the back of the archives, my real sanctuary. It was the safest place in the building. Inside, it was dry and blessedly quiet. I found a couple of candles and managed to light them with a book of matches from my desk drawer. The small space was filled with a warm, flickering glow. We peeled off our soaked outer layers, leaving them in a puddle by the door. I was down to my t-shirt and jeans, both of which were still damp. Caleb had been wearing a thick flannel shirt over his t-shirt. He stripped it off and, without a word, handed it to me. "Here," he said. "You're colder than I am." The flannel was thick and dry and smelled faintly of him, a scent of sawdust, rain, and something uniquely Caleb. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled off my own wet t-shirt and slid my arms into the warm, heavy fabric. It was huge on me, the sleeves hanging down past my hands. It felt like an embrace. When I looked up, he was watching me. His own t-shirt was clinging to his chest and shoulders, outlining the powerful muscles beneath. His hair was a dark, wet mess, and his eyes, in the candlelight, were dark and incredibly intense. The air in the small office crackled. All the unspoken things from before, all the near touches and lingering glances, coalesced in that tiny, candlelit room. The storm outside was a distant rumble, but a different kind of storm was building between us. "You were really brave back there," he said, his voice low and raspy. He took a small step closer. The room was so small that he was suddenly right there, his presence overwhelming. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I tried to deflect, to retreat to the safety of modesty. "I was just doing my job," I mumbled, looking down at the ridiculously long sleeves of his shirt. "Protecting the collection." "No," he said, and his voice was so soft it was almost a whisper. "It was more than that." I looked up, and he was closer still. I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. He was looking at me in a way I had only ever dreamed of being looked at, with a raw, undisguised hunger that was both terrifying and exhilarating. My breath hitched. He lifted a hand, as if to touch my face, but then let it drop. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. And then, it was gone, replaced by a look of pure resolve. His eyes dropped from my eyes to my mouth. Then, in one swift, fluid motion that stole the air from my lungs, his hand shot out. He didn't grab my arm or my shoulder. His fingers hooked into the belt loop of my jeans. He gave a sharp, definitive tug, pulling me forward the last few inches that separated us until my body was flush against his. He held me there, his other hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb stroking gently against my skin. My mind went completely blank. All I could feel was the solid wall of his chest, the heat of his hand on my neck, the intoxicating scent of him. I stared up at him, my heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He searched my face for a fraction of a second, looking for what? Permission? Protest? He found neither. And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was a kiss of certainty, of pent-up energy finally released. It was demanding and hungry, but not rough. It was the taste of rain and adrenaline and something else, something deeper that I couldn't name. I made a small sound in the back of my throat, and my hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to grip his arms. His pull on my belt loop tightened, erasing any possibility of space between us, and his other hand tangled in my hair. He didn't stop. He kissed me as if he'd been wanting to do it for weeks, for months. And as my mind finally caught up with my body, I realized with a dizzying, heart-stopping certainty that I had been wanting this for just as long. The world outside my office ceased to exist. There was no storm, no museum, no shattered window. There was only the flickering candlelight, the warm, heavy flannel against my skin, and Caleb's mouth on mine. The kiss eventually softened, slowing from a desperate claiming to a deeper, more intimate exploration. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. His hand was still tangled in my hair, his fingers still hooked firmly in my belt loop, anchoring me to him. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the frantic beat of my own heart. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? A line had been crossed so decisively that there was no going back. Eventually, utterly exhausted emotionally and physically, we sank down onto the small, worn sofa against the wall. He never let me go. I ended up curled against his side, my head resting on his shoulder, his arms securely around me. The flannel shirt he'd given me was a warm cocoon. I fell asleep to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the lingering taste of him on my lips, feeling safer than I had ever felt in my life. Morning came with a strange, watery gray light filtering under the office door. The storm had passed. The silence from the main building was absolute. The world was holding its breath. I woke up first, still tucked against Caleb. He was sleeping soundly, his face relaxed and younger in repose. For a long moment, I just watched him, trying to reconcile this man, sleeping in my office with his arm around me, with the man I had watched from a distance for so long. It felt like a dream. When he woke, it was with a slow blink. He looked at me, and for a terrifying second, I saw confusion in his eyes. Then, recognition dawned, followed by something else. Something cautious. He sat up, gently disentangling his arm from around me. The warmth was gone, and I immediately felt its absence. The easy intimacy of the night had vanished with the darkness, replaced by a tense, uncertain daylight. We should check the damage," he said, his voice husky with sleep. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stood up, stretched, and started pulling on his still damp clothes. I did the same, handing him back his flannel shirt. Our fingers brushed, and we both recoiled as if burned. The air was thick with things unsaid. The kiss, which had felt so right and inevitable in the heat of the moment, now hung between us like a ghost. We walked out of the museum into a world washed clean. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The damage to the town was significant, but the museum had survived, thanks in large part to him. We exchanged a few stilted words. He said he had to go check on his own house and his crew. I said I had to call Mr. Harris. He got in his truck, gave me a brief, unreadable look, and drove away. I was left standing alone on the museum steps, the silence he left behind 1,000 times louder than the storm had ever been. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a quiet, internal torment. I replayed the kiss, the entire night, over and over in my head. I dissected every word, every touch, every glance. The way he'd grabbed my belt loop, it had been so confident, so sure. But his retreat in the morning had been just as decisive. Had it just been the adrenaline? The fear of the storm? The enclosed space? The relief of survival? Had he just been caught up in the moment and woken up with a crushing sense of regret? The thought was a cold stone in my stomach. I'd allowed myself, for a few short hours, to hope. And now, I was paying the price. The loneliness I'd felt before was nothing compared to this new, sharper ache. This was the loneliness of a near miss, of a connection tasted and then snatched away. Caleb and his team were back at the museum by the end of the week, starting the official repairs on the broken window and assessing other storm damage. Seeing him was agony. He was once again Caleb the contractor, all business and professional efficiency. He was surrounded by his crew, his laughter once again booming in the halls, but it never seemed directed at me. Our interactions reverted to what they had been before the storm, but worse. Before, our brief mornings had been neutral. Now, They were loaded with the weight of that night. He'd nod at me, a quick, tight gesture, and his eyes would slide away almost immediately. He seemed to be actively avoiding me. Each curt nod, each averted gaze, was another piece of evidence for the prosecution in the trial I was holding in my mind. The verdict was clear. He regretted it. He was embarrassed. He was straight, and he'd had a momentary lapse in judgment in a high-stress situation, and now he just wanted to forget it ever happened. He probably thought I was pathetic, waiting for something more. The shame was suffocating. I started taking my lunch breaks in my office and finding alternate routes through the museum just to avoid the possibility of running into him. We were two people in a shared space, bound by a secret, doing a painful, elaborate dance of avoidance. The silence between us stretched for a week, growing louder and more unbearable with each passing day. After a week of this silent torture, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. The not knowing was eating me alive. I decided that night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, that I had to do something. I had to say something. Even if it was just to give him an out, to tell him it was okay, that we could forget it. At least then the tension would break. At least then I would know for sure. I would finally have my answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. The next day, I spent the entire afternoon psyching myself up. I planned my speech. It would be casual, breezy. Hey, about that night. Crazy, right? Adrenaline is a wild thing. No worries, just something to release the pressure, to let him off the hook. I waited until the end of the day, until his crew had packed up and their trucks had rumbled away. I saw his truck was still in the parking lot. This was it. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweating. I took a deep breath and walked out of the archives, my rehearsed lines turning to ash in my mouth. I saw him standing by the now boarded-up window in the main hall, just staring at it. He looked tired. He looked just as stressed as I felt. Before I could say a word, he turned, as if he'd sensed my presence. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in a week, he didn't look away. "Miles," he said, his voice quiet. "Can we talk?" The question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. All my carefully prepared speeches evaporated. I could only manage a single, shaky nod. He gestured toward a bench in one of the quieter galleries, away from the main entrance. We sat down, a careful foot of space between us, but the air was so charged it felt like we were touching. He stared at his hands, which were clasped between his knees. "Look," he started, then stopped. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I've been a complete idiot this past week. I'm sorry. I was so surprised I actually spoke." "Sorry for what?" He finally looked at me, and his face was a portrait of frustration and vulnerability. "For this. For being so weird. For avoiding you. I didn't know what to say." He shook his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "I kiss you like the world is ending, and then I can barely look at you. Smooth, right?" My heart, which had been lodged somewhere in my throat, slid back into its rightful place. "I thought you regretted it," I confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought it was a mistake, just the storm, and that you wanted to forget it." His eyes widened. "No. God, no, Miles." He leaned forward, closing the space between us. "That's what I thought you were thinking. You were so quiet the next morning, and then you started avoiding me. I was convinced I'd completely misread everything, that I'd crossed a line and freaked you out." We stared at each other, the absurdity of the situation dawning on us. We had both spent a week in our own private misery, convinced of the other's rejection, both paralyzed by the exact same fear. A slow laugh escaped me, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Caleb started laughing too, a deep, warm sound that filled the gallery. "So," he said, his laughter subsiding, his expression turning serious again. "Just so we're clear, you're not freaked out." "No," I said, my voice soft but sure. "I'm not freaked out." "Good." He took a breath, as if bracing himself. "Because, Miles, that kiss wasn't about the storm. I mean, maybe the storm gave me the courage or the excuse, but it wasn't the reason." He looked down at his hands again. "The truth is, I've been trying to work up the nerve to talk to you for months. Ever since I first saw you. The world tilted on its axis." "What?" "I used to see you at the coffee shop near my office sometimes," he admitted, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "You'd be sitting there with a book, and you just had this, I don't know, this quietness about you. It was interesting." When Mr. Harris called me about the museum job, I probably quoted him a lower price than I should have, just for the chance to be around. He had noticed me. He had noticed me long before the storm, before I thought I had even registered on his radar. The man I had watched from a distance had, in his own way, been watching me right back. All my assumptions, all my carefully constructed walls of self-protection, crumbled into dust. I watched you too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. From my window. I never thought that I'd be interested. He finished for me, his voice gentle. Yeah, I get that a lot. It makes things complicated sometimes. He gave me a small, rueful smile. I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of screwing it all up. So was I said. We looked at each other, the last of the tension finally dissolving, replaced by a profound and giddy sense of understanding. We had been two idiots, circling each other for months, both trapped in our own heads. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the bench. His touch was warm and sure. So, he said again, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. Now that we've established that we're both idiots, can I try that again? The kiss. But without a hurricane this time. I didn't answer with words. I leaned in, and he met me halfway. This kiss was nothing like the first one. It wasn't born of adrenaline and desperation. It was slow and deep and full of all the words we hadn't been able to say. It was a kiss of relief, of discovery, of a beginning. It was confident and mutual, and it tasted, unequivocally, like hope. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, gray dream into a world of startling color. Our first official date wasn't in a dark, storm-battered museum, but at a small Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and flickering candles that were purely for atmosphere. We talked for hours, really talked, filling in the spaces that our silent observations had left empty. He took me to his workshop, a huge, dusty barn that smelled wonderfully of cedar and sawdust. He showed me how to use a wood lathe, his hands guiding mine, his body pressed against my back. I was clumsy and awkward, but I loved every second of it. He had a patience and a gentleness that I never would have guessed at from watching him command his work crew. In return, I gave him a private tour of the archives after hours. I showed him my favorite things, the fragile, spidery handwriting in a 19th century diary, the ghostly image of the town square in a glass plate negative. He touched everything with a surprising reverence, his calloused fingers tracing the history with a tenderness that made my heart ache in the best possible way. He understood. He saw the magic in it, just like I did. We fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm. Weekends were spent hiking on trails I never knew existed, or simply curled up on my sofa, reading in comfortable silence. He met my few friends, who were delighted. I met a loud, boisterous group of guys who, after an initial period of sizing me up, welcomed me with backslapping enthusiasm and endless offers of beer. The world I had thought was closed to me opened its doors wide. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long simply evaporated. A few months after what we now just called the storm, we were at my apartment. A real storm had rolled in, a proper autumn thunderstorm with booming thunder and flashes of lightning. In the past, I would have found it unsettling. But now it was different. We stood by the living room window, watching the rain streak down the glass, the city lights blurring into watercolors. Caleb's arm was wrapped securely around my shoulders, pulling me into his side. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The rumbles of thunder seemed distant, harmless. He rested his chin on the top of my head. "You know," he said, his voice a low vibration against my ear. "I think I'm starting to like storms," I smiled, turning my face up to look at him. The fear that had inadvertently brought us together had been replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. The storm wasn't a threat anymore. It was just weather. The real shelter was right here, in his arms. My life had once been a fortress of quiet routines, built to protect me from the unpredictability of the world and from the ache of my own solitude. I thought safety was in order and control. But then Caleb arrived, a force of nature as powerful as any hurricane. He didn't just breach my walls. He showed me that the point wasn't to keep the storm out. Sometimes, you have to be brave enough to walk into the heart of it. You have to be willing to be pulled in, to let go of your fear, and to hold on tight. because you might just find that the very thing you were so afraid of was actually leading you home.